Commencing a solemn week for Israel, of course, that doesn't stop the politics, which centres now on a standoff between the Prime Minister and his domestic intelligence chief. It's only intensifying. Plus, we have an interview with the best-selling author and podcaster, Sam Harris. It's Unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the news. Before we talk about anything else, we should say that remind our listeners that our very first live event after 4 virtual years will be on the same stage in London at the Queen Elizabeth Hall, June 8th. And our star-studded lineup that we have talked about this week, historian and author. Yes, thank you.
Roll.
That's
very helpful.
helpful.
Roll effect.
Because also Jonathan was a drummer in his early years. No one's going to believe that.
No one's going to believe that because it's not
So
true. No, go on. I interrupted you. Our fabulous lineup.
Historian and author Yuval Noah Harari, West End star Andy Nyman, and singer Mira Awad. We're really, really excited about all these names who will join us, as I said, on June 8th.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to that. For one thing, it's just a massive event for us to be in the same room, let alone the same stage. But
it's such a massive event. We thought we'd just invite hundreds of people to just share in that moment, that historic moment.
Just to see that, but no, it's going to be terrific to have one of our, in-depth conversations there in front of an audience with Yuval Noah Harari. He's been a friend of the podcast. He's been with us a couple of times, but this, I think, will be very, very different on stage there. And then I think, people need a bit of entertaining. Andy Nyman, fresh from winning rave reviews as Max Bialystock in The Producers. That's about to transfer to the West End. He's been a big hit on Fiddler on the Roof, all kinds of big West End parts. And Mira Awad, fantastic musician, singer, artist. Really interesting background, identifies herself as Palestinian, Israeli, both parts of her identity. We'll talk to them, we'll hear them play and sing. I think it's going to be, a proper show. So if you have not booked yet, do now, because I'm very glad to say the tickets are going quite fast. So make sure you are there on June the 8th. But we said it's one of those big weeks in Israel. Israel tends to do this, to sort of cluster these days, and often I think we've talked before on the podcast about the kind of mood swings that are involved, but as we speak, Israel is marking Yom HaShoah.
Yes, it's in a week. We are beginning this week, which is the most sacred week of the Israeli secular calendar. As you said, today, Thursday, as we sit here, is Holocaust Memorial Day, Yom HaShoah. Next week on Wednesday is Memorial Day for fallen soldiers, followed by Independence Day. And I have to tell you about this conversation, Jonathan, that I had with my kids this morning, which I think is indicative of this kind of strange reality that we live in. I reminded them that it was Holocaust Memorial Day. They knew, of course. And then I said there will be a memorial siren at 10 a.m. And don't worry, it's not an alert siren indicating that ballistic missiles are about to hit Israel. It's a different kind of siren. And I thought to myself about this sort of strange and surreal Israeli childhood that they need to experience, right? That they need to know and to tell the different sirens apart, right? That this week you'll hear a siren marking people trying to kill your ancestors 80 years ago. Next week you'll hear a siren commemorating fallen soldiers killed by neighboring states trying to attack Israel over the past 77 years. In between, you might also hear alert sirens of people trying to kill you now. It's not funny in any way. It's just this sort of weird reality. And of course, they accepted it a lot more easily than I thought. But it's just, I think, indicative of kind of this world that we're living in. The second year of this war, and the shadow of the war, the shadow of hostages still being held in Gaza, shadow of a growing rift inside the Israeli society. And these days are happening, and they kind of the convergence of the shadow of the present with the shadow of the past.
I just want to go back to the very first thing you said, because I think some of our listeners outside Israel will wonder about this, which is explaining Yom HaShoah to very young children. So I'm a governor of a Jewish primary school here in London. One of the issues we talk about sometimes is how do you explain this to very young children? And there's all kinds of books have been written, child development psychologists, about how little you should tell very young children and gradually more. How on earth do you do that? Do you explain? I mean, how do you begin to explain what this day is, where cars stop and sirens go off, about this event so long ago to a child who's that young?
I mean, look, it's interesting. I have children 3 different ages, so it's 11, 9, and 7. And it's interesting how it develops. You tell the story very delicately, of there was a war, and how to explain that. And you don't go into numbers, and you definitely don't go into horror stories. But then little by little, particularly after October 7th happened, and the words Shoah are being said a lot more common. It's a more common practice to use them. I don't think ubiquitously, but you use it more. Then I suddenly realized that one of my kids had this confusion and said, didn't the Shoah happen here in Israel? And I'm like, no, it didn't. And so it's really complicated. I think the easiest way I can answer is just going very slowly, talking about the family and what, parts of our family and even the community that was there in Europe before. It's a very delicate thing, and you always discover that they know much more than you thought they did. So that is the way it is. I don't have a good answer to how to explain this to children, but it's definitely, because of the circumstances, becoming much more complicated than it used to be.
Yeah, no, that's something that Jewish parents the world over will resonate with them, because this is a conversation that every Jewish parent at some point has with their children, to explain what this event is and why people are looking sad on particular days and so on. As I said at the top, politics has not stopped, even with this week of sacred pause that is envisaged. The politics rolls on. And this week, this standoff that we've been reporting on the podcast between the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his, I must say, outgoing or fired head of the Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, it sort of reached a new pitch.
It did, due to Ronen Bar's affidavit that he submitted to the High Court of Justice. This is all part of the fact that Netanyahu is trying to dismiss Ronen Bar, and the fact that he's doing it while the head of Shin Bet is actually investigating Netanyahu's own closest advisors in a scandal called Qatargate. This led to petitions to the Supreme Court in Israel against his dismissal. So I think we need to pause on the incredibly serious and grave accusations, really, leveled by the head of Shin Bet against the Prime Minister. He says this: the Prime Minister expressed to me on more than one occasion his desire to see the Shin Bet act against citizens involved in protest activity demonstrations. I was also made aware, he says, of an expectation to monitor protest funders. Furthermore, during a conversation regarding the protest movement, it was made clear to me that in an event of a constitutional crisis, I would be expected to obey the Prime Minister and not the High Court of Justice. These are very, very grave accusations. Now, this is not a situation we have gray or even white. It's either black or very, very black. Because if you are someone who believes Ronen Bar and what he is saying here, he is describing the making of an autocrat. If you believe Netanyahu's version of things, i.e., that the head of Shin Bet is trying to topple Netanyahu and topple his government, and he is fabricating a case against him called Qatargate, that is also terrible. I mean, any version of this story is, as I said, it's either black or very, very black. And as an Israeli, you sit in front of this. You don't know, as I said to you a week ago, there are polls saying 27% of Israelis believe that Ronen Bar fabricated the Qatargate case in order to prevent Netanyahu from firing him. This is a really, really scary situation. And it is not the sort of fumes of this rift inside the Israeli society is felt very tangibly. This week, the head of opposition, Yair Lapid, said the incitement against Ronen Bar is so severe that he's actually worried that there might be another political assassination in Israel. He's, of course, referring to the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, Israel's prime minister, 30 years ago. So you feel how dangerous, all of this really is.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to linger for a moment on Ronen Bar's central accusation. I think you're right that this will be one of those, again, those sort of litmus tests where you will be able to tell exactly how people think about 100 issues depending on who they believe here. In other words, people on the right, people who support Netanyahu, they'll believe him. And anyone who dislikes Netanyahu for years or opposes his handling of the war, they'll believe Ronen Bar. It will just divide the country down what has become the essential fault line, in a way, of Israeli politics, which is for Bibi or against him. And so who you believe, that will be dependent on that. But this accusation of his is so grave. The idea of asking the head of intelligence to be loyal to him rather than to the country, in effect, to say your number one loyalty is to protect me rather than the citizens of Israel. This is exactly, you said, the hallmark of an autocrat. I can't help but draw the parallel with what's going on in the United States. We know that Donald Trump, because he says the quiet part out loud, perhaps that's the difference between him and Netanyahu, he has demanded that. He said, I want generals who are loyal to me. He talks about my generals. Famously that confrontation with James Comey, the head of the FBI, which is a, not full analog to the Shin Bet, but not far off, saying again, you've got to be loyal to me. And he said, I'm loyal to the Constitution and so on. That is, if Ronen Bar is telling the truth, and I think there's no reason to say he's not, but of course that reflects much about how I see things. That is not just to talk about an emerging autocrat, but to say that is the behavior of an autocrat. And I do think there is this mirroring that's going on between what we're seeing in Washington and what we're seeing in Jerusalem. And I think it's not just mirroring. I think it's all, if you can be simultaneously a mirror and a kind of, cloud cover, it is giving cover to Prime Minister of Israel, because what was once so taboo and so shocking and scandalous is daily being normalized, because you can say, well, look, if the American president demands that kind of loyalty, why can't I? I know that isn't Netanyahu's argument at the moment. His argument is, I didn't do this. But there is a way these scandals develop, which is first, I didn't do it, then I may have done a little bit of it, and third, I did it, but it's not so bad. That's often the series of denials, and I think we're in the early stages of of that process. But I do think the two are reflective of each other and troubling all the more for that.
Yes, so we should also say that Netanyahu himself, who was supposed to, also write his own affidavit to the High Court of Justice, he asked to do that. He was supposed to do it on Thursday. He asked for a bit of a delay till Sunday. By the way, another thing that Ronen Bar is saying, he says that the prime minister exerted unusual and repeated pressure on me to issue a directive, in effect rendering his trial, Netanyahu's trial, impossible because of security-related issues. I mean, we shouldn't forget that point in his affidavit as well. We should also, I think, mention that Yoram Cohen, former head of Shin Bet, also told the High Court of Justice that Netanyahu asked him to disqualify Naftali Bennett from sitting in the cabinet when Bennett was part of Netanyahu's government. So you're seeing all of these signs. We don't know what's in the classified document that Ronen Bar sent to the judges. That might have pieces of evidence, but that is where we are at this point. And if you are one of those people who are very concerned and believe Ronen Bar, then even Ronen Bar will obviously step down sometime in the near future. He said he would, but then who will be his replacement? And if Netanyahu is the one appointing his replacement, and you see this list of demands, then that is a very, very concerning moment. You can ask the question, by the way, if this is what the Prime Minister of Israel has asked from you, why is this, the moment where you decide to tell it? And you can turn that question to several heads of Shin Bet. It's a legitimate question to ask. I would assume that what they would say in response is, we thought we are protecting the state of Israel from that position better than from outside the organization. But I think that's also a legitimate question to ask.
You mean it's a legitimate question to ask these people why they took the job in the first place?
No, why, if this is what happened, if there was a moment, look, this is really a grave moment in the history of Israel. If there was a moment in which Netanyahu said, as prime minister, to the head of the Shin Bet, if there is a constitutional crisis, you should be loyal to me and not to the courts and not to the judiciary. If there was a moment like that, then why are we hearing about it only now after Netanyahu is firing Ronen Bar?
Right. So I was just going to say, by the way, if this comes down to who do you believe, the fact that Yoram Cohen has backed, in effect, corroborated Ronen Bar's account should be really important. That takes it away from being the personal animus of one man, which is what Netanyahu wants to say, and begins to say there is a pattern here. And I think if this eventually comes down to the Supreme Court deciding who do they believe, that will surely be relevant. We should, adding into the list of charges, I think it's hugely serious that Ronen Bar said that he was being asked to essentially spying on, demonstrators, political opponents. The whole protest movement, we know, in what we were talking about on here on the podcast, summer of 2023, it was kind of half the country were opposing the judicial coup. The idea that they were branded sort of targets by the Prime Minister, hugely sinister. Just one extra element in this. There's a question now about whether the Prime Minister himself will put his own signature to this affidavit, or whether he'll get aides to doing, including his senior military advisor. Now, the minute I heard that, I thought to myself, a reminder. Israel is a country at war. The military need to be focused on that. And instead, time, energy, focus is being diverted to yet again the personal political travails of the Prime Minister. If you are, even a big time Israeli sort of security hawk, you have to at some point, don't you surely say, this man Netanyahu, whose whole promise is that he's the guardian of Israel, Mr. Security, constantly snarled up in these political battles. It's 1 minute he's in the courtroom on the corruption charges, the next it's this battle with Ronen Bar, to the point where he's getting his military advisor not to focus on how do you defeat Hamas, but instead get me out of this hole that I'm in with Ronen Bar. It's just a small illustration of what this is doing to the country. The country was vulnerable on October 7th for, among other reasons, because it was so divided over the judicial coup. And here we are again with energy, time, focus being diverted. I know Netanyahu tries to play that card, say, therefore leave me alone and let me just govern the country unhindered without checks and balances. No, that's wrong. Of course there should be these legal challenges. But the man has been, in or around the Prime Minister's office for 30 years. Enough is enough. And I think I think it's now time for the right, as it were, security hawks, and a whole lot of former generals, former ministers of defense and others put their name recently to an ad in the Israeli papers saying essentially this, that Netanyahu is a problem, poses a security threat to Israel. This is one reason among many why that's true. His focus is now solely on himself, and he's making sure that's the military's focus too.
The issue of signing is not at all a technical one, as you mentioned, at all, because if the court decides that Ronen Bar is telling the truth and Netanyahu lied, then potentially Netanyahu can find that he's perjured himself. If he doesn't sign the affidavit, then he's not in that kind of danger, just to make that note.
Sure. And if anything, that would be grounds for suspicion. If he doesn't want to put his name to it, it says he's worried about a perjury finding.
We should, I probably say a few more words about this mixture. We opened up by talking about how the shadow of the past, mixes up with the shadow of the present, and also, of Yom HaShoah, but also next week, Yom HaAtzmaut, Independence Day, how all this will look, second Independence Day, into the war, and also the fact that the government that was in place on October 7th still is running the show, quite literally, and what that means in Israel. Just these thoughts, you see these stories, and we are, as we said, it's Yom HaShoah today, and March of the Living in Auschwitz, and you see survivors. The word we use in Israel, by the way, is survivors of Hamas's captivity. Women like Agam Berger, young women like Agam Berger and Ori Megidish, who were held by Hamas, walking in that march. Family members of hostages still being held in Gaza, walking in that march. There's a very powerful report that we aired yesterday of Omer Venkert, survivor of captivity, and his grandmother, who's a Holocaust survivor, and their experiences that kind of echo each other. I'm not, I think Alon Ohel, his father, said this beautifully. Alon is still being held in Gaza. He said, I'm not comparing the two periods in history, but there are some parallels that you can't avoid making. So these are the thoughts as we are in these hours of Yom HaShoah here in Israel.
Yeah, I mean, it is in Israel only. Holocaust Memorial Day outside Israel falls on January the 27th, marking the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz this year, the 80th anniversary. It just so happened that that was in the first few days of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And I think that made a very big difference, because while the war goes on, and I'm aware this will be hard for a lot of listeners to hear, I think, but it is very hard outside Israel to do anything which essentially asks for sympathy or empathy for Israel, and by extension Jews, right now. They're normally at this time of year, even when, for example, coming up is Yom HaZikaron, the Memorial Day. That's the solemnity, the fact that it comes so soon after Yom HaShoah. You can expect there to be a sort of moment, a pause, where some people, not of course those who are always perennially hostile to Israel, but others will feel some sympathy. There are very few takers for that now outside the country. More Palestinians have been killed since the ceasefire, the one that was holding in late January. Since that ceasefire ended in March, more Palestinians have been killed than Israelis were killed on October 7th, just in the gap since the end of the ceasefire. That is what makes the news. That is where people's sympathies are going outside Israel. The story of the paramedics, we talked about it, the incident of the paramedics killed in Gaza. More and more evidence, it's ran a detailed report the other day suggesting that there was evidence pointing at some of those paramedics being killed at point blank range. The Israeli official account has been shifting. That is huge abroad. It is still making, big news here on radio bulletins, TV, in the newspapers. That coupled with the numbers. The thing I was saying that it will be hard for people to hear, I think, is that it is very difficult to remember a time when there has been less sympathy for Israel around, and I'm afraid by extension Jews. And of course, it should be the case that the Shoah stands alone, that the Holocaust is its own thing. But this is how these things work, that the mood is not receptive. And I know this just because, I've written a book in the past and a new book coming up relating to the Holocaust. I can tell when I talk about this subject to people who are not Jewish and are not in Israel. Right now, this is not a mood where people want to hear about us as victims and our suffering and our pain. Because right now, what they're seeing on their screens is that's got eating up their sympathy.
So there's a lot to unpack in what you said. I think that first of all, we should say that the story of the paramedics has been extensively reported on Israeli media as well. So it's not one of those cases when Israel is focusing on something else and the world is focusing. I think it has been reported on television, newspapers. And I'm not even going into that. We talked about it last week, and we should just mention that the IDF Chief of Staff dismissed the Deputy Battalion Commander. The commander of the 14th Brigade received a formal reprimand. I don't think it will end with this. I think it will continue this investigation and its repercussions. This is a horrible incident. I just want to zoom out a little bit because you talked about sympathy and about empathy. And you also said that the Shoah should stand alone. I would also make the claim that October 7th should stand alone. And what we have seen since then is as if, 9/11 would have always been reported through the prism of the war in Afghanistan and nothing else. And that's what we've been seeing in the world. It's just about the war in Gaza. I think less and less so about the horrors of October 7th that we are still in many ways living. I feel like when you say the word empathy, and I'm sorry, my mind is going in all kinds of directions today, as it usually does on Holocaust Memorial Day. And I think of my father, who was born, if he had been born in his family town of Poland in 1941, his chances of survival as a Jewish boy would obviously not be high, but he was born in Kazakhstan because the family escaped. When he came back to his Polish town with his mother, to discover no one was left of the Jews, believe me, there was no empathy to him or to his mother. Quite the opposite, actually, when everyone knew what happened. I think there are groups in this world, and you mentioned that as well, that will never show sympathy to Israel, not because of what it does, but because of what it is. And we can't have that. Really, I don't know what kind of discussion we can have with those kinds of groups. I do think that there is a discussion to be had with people who really care deeply about Israel and are troubled by the things that, you are troubled by and I am troubled by. And there's a conversation there. But if we are honest about that conversation, we also have to mention that Hamas throughout this war has used facilities, convoys, workers themselves of these kinds of organizations to transfer Hamas operatives and to transfer ammunition. I'm not saying anything about this incident specifically or about the war, which is, as you know, highly contested inside Israel as well. I just think that we need to separate between our desire for the whole world to have empathy towards us Jews, which will probably be a failed attempt, and the serious questions that we can and should ask about what is going on in Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, just for clarity, I'm not talking about the people who are, like I said, people who are the perennial haters. Of course, they're beyond reach, and I'm not interested in those, in any attempt to try and win them over. That's not what I was talking about. I was rather talking about those people who have previously been either neutral or been quite well disposed towards Israel, who just look at what's going on now and cannot. Even after some effort. These are the people who were moved by October 7th, but they see what's happening now.
I think that if you want to hear the case made for Israel in a deep and thoughtful way, I would wait for our conversation with Sam Harris, among other reasons to wait for it. I think it's a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, and we get into, with Sam Harris, some of these questions actually around, even the ethics of how this whole war has been fought. So Yom Ha'atzmaut is coming next week, Independence Day. Israel being Israel, of course, there are multiple rows about this involving, from every angle, but particularly over the business of lighting a torch for Independence Day, a category now which has been expanded because it used to be one person per light, and now 3, I think. So there are 36 invitations, is that right, that have gone out? So lots of arguments. What's the story?
So first of all, we should say the torch lighting ceremony is a tradition in Israel. It is that hour that Israel pivots from Memorial Day to Independence Day. Our founding fathers, or specifically our founding father, David Ben-Gurion, wanted that to those 2 days to be adjacent. So it really is sort of a pivot through the torch lighting ceremony. It's been going on since the 50s. It's a very sort of arcane ceremony. I think a lot of Israelis used to grow, I grew up watching it. In recent years, particularly since October 7th, and because the government that is responsible for this ceremony was also the government in power when October 7th happened and is still in power, and it's been very politicized. In fact, last year, there was an alternative extinguishing of the torches ceremony done by the families of the hostages and the bereaved families from October 7th. Last year, even unprecedentedly, the ceremony itself, the torch lighting ceremony, was recorded. The official reason was security reasons, but actually the real reason was that the government didn't want any sort of protest during the ceremony. This year, it's going to be live, but as you said, Israel is Israel, and there's always going to be arguments. So it's considered a pretty big honor to be asked to light a torch. As you said, once these torches, 12 torches, are the representatives of the biblical tribes of Israel. There used to be one person who would light a torch. Now there are a few. I think it's the government trying to signal that they're trying to erase the fact that there are a few people who refuse to light the torch in the ceremony. So there are more people doing it. A few years ago, actually, 2017 is when they started this tradition that I should admit I like, which is to have one representative of the diaspora lighting a torch. I think we should be for that generally, as the podcast that has this conversation between Israel and diaspora. This year, the man who was chosen to do that is Ben Shapiro. Now, let's pause on that for a moment, because obviously, and it's not controversial to say that Ben Shapiro is a controversial figure, and particularly what caught the eye of many Israelis. Israel is this paradox in which, on the one hand, the religious institution rules our lives. On the other hand, we're very liberal, relatively liberal when it comes to the LGBTQ community. So that is what caught the eyes of many Israelis, his views against the community. And when you think of the fact that on the one hand, you will have Dana International standing next to him lighting the torch, and on the other hand, Emily Damari, who had to hide her, basically her sexual identity while in Hamas's captivity because her family was concerned that they would do something to harm her. it will be an interesting moment in Israel's history to see that image.
Yeah, Ben Shapiro, I think it's a very telling choice. He's a big Trump guy. He's part of the conservative media, right-wing media. Conservative is the wrong word. Right-wing media in America. There's also a British-Israeli lawyer who's really very vocally pro-Netanyahu. And it just deepens that sense that the only people sort of welcome who are included, even in national occasions, are those people who are aligned with the right. And I worry about this a lot because it more and more seals, and maybe some people listening to this will think, well, this ship sailed a long time ago, but it seals in the idea that support for Israel is something associated and exclusive to the right, the political right. If you're of the political right, then you're welcome, Ben Shapiro, etc. If you're not, then be an opponent of Israel. That is such a dead end for Israel because many, many Jews around the world do not identify with the political right. Young Jews, for example, opposing Trump. Why say to them, look, Israel is for the pro-Trump people. It's not for you. That's a long-term strategic folly because generations will say, okay, if that's the choice, either I'm a liberal or I'm pro-Israel. Well, my liberalism is more important, and goodbye Israel. So I really worry about the message they're sending. These decisions should be, I know it's a faint hope, even a quaint hope. They should be non-partisan. And you should have had, if you're going to have somebody from the diaspora, in fact, 2 or 3 people with strong diaspora connections, then make it a spread. Make it somebody who's a bit unexpected, who's quite a sort of liberal figure, who is nevertheless, identified with Israel. Why, or identifies with Israel? Why not? I can see your face. You think I'm asking for and auditioning for that role. No, is the answer.
I just made a little note in my notebook.
I saw the face. But there are other people. We've had so many on our podcast. Just think, you could have a Simon Sharma, you could have an Anthony Julius, you could have Dara
Howard
Horn.
Jacobson.
I don't know. Howard Jacobson.
We can go on.
We could go on, just, great writers or thinkers or artists, musicians around the world who are Jewish, who do not repudiate Israel, who stand with Israel, but do not necessarily like this government. Why not? But instead, the message is you have to be not just right, but pretty far right now to be accepted in Israel. That is a very, very bad move.
Miri Regev, I know you're listening to this podcast. Just make a note next year, Jonathan Friedland. Just write it down in a post-it somewhere.
I think that's a lost cause and probably not one I would even accept. We've been promising it in this bumper episode, our long, in-depth conversation with a huge figure in the world of ideas and indeed of this medium of podcast.
Sam Harris is one of the best-known intellectuals in America, philosopher, neuroscientist, best-selling author, and podcaster. Thank you so much for being on Unholy, Sam.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I'm a big fan of the podcast. So thank you.
We're very happy to hear that. There's so many places where I could start this conversation, but I actually want to anchor it in this week in Israel, which is marking Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. Israel does it separately from the rest of the world. And you spoke recently in your podcast, and you said this. You said, if we ever have a full eruption of anti-Semitic intolerance in America or Western Europe again, if we really descend into something awful, much of the responsibility will be on Elon. You meant Elon Musk. And I guess what I wanted to ask is sort of 2 parts of a question. One is, do you think that the world might descend into something more awful than we saw in the past year? And why would you point to him as the person to blame?
Well, the answer to the first question is, I don't know. I certainly wouldn't have been high on my list of concerns prior to October 7th. The aftermath of October 7th, certainly for, I think for everyone, but certainly for diaspora Jews, has been, horror and astonishment, not occasioned obviously by the atrocity itself, but even more so by the reaction to it and the moral confusion that made that reaction possible. The fact that we had demonstrations in so many countries against Israel and in places explicitly in support of Hamas and everywhere tacitly in support of Hamas, before Israel had even responded was just, that's a that's that was such a gargantuan surprise that I don't think my sense of what is possible will ever recover. Right? So in the aftermath of all that, I now think more or less anything is possible, and I couldn't have said that a few years ago. As to the probability, I don't know, but with respect to the second claim, that a lot of the responsibility for this explosion of anti-Semitism rests on social media generally and on X in particular, I just think that's pretty obvious. And there, I think Elon is culpable, for what he's done to the platform. And he has made it a digital cesspool. But it's also his own personal behavior as a private citizen on the platform. I mean, how he amplifies the reach of conspiracists and white supremacists and anti-Semites and proper lunatics. He's brought some of the most odious characters back on the platform with great fanfare. People like Nick Fuentes and Alex Jones. He, blithely interacts with people who 2 seconds of research would reveal that they're people he should not be giving attention to in any way. And every time he interacts with somebody, that person becomes quite a bit more famous than they were a few seconds ago. I mean, they gain hundreds of thousands of followers. It's really his personal, again, beyond what he's done to the algorithm, which I think is also has not been good. And beyond, bringing, replatforming people who had been kicked off, which also has not been good. It's his personal reckless behavior that I think has been so despicable. And obviously he's, his aping, Nazi salutes, whatever the meaning of his actual gesture was in his own head, or in fact, the fact that when he does that, he doesn't apologize like an adult. Like it would have been so easy for him to have signaled a disavowal of anti-Semitism in the aftermath of all that. But he didn't do that. He just made Nazi jokes and trolled his critics, and then gave money to the AfD party in Germany. Right? I mean, it's like there's something so callous and reckless about his political behavior now that I just think he's especially culpable for the moment we're in.
Just staying with the very particular Holocaust dimension of this, something you've been speaking about recently is the mainstreaming of David Irving style Holocaust denial. And you said earlier, and I have to say I sympathize this, nothing can shock us anymore. But this is quite shocking. And it's happened via pseudo-historians such as Darryl Cooper, not just on social media, but going on the Joe Rogan podcast, which by some measure may be the biggest platform now in United States sort of media. How has that happened? In other words, there's anti-Semitism, and you've given us an account of that, but the specific denial or denial-adjacent sentiments being pretty mainstreamed, how has that happened?
Well, it's one might say it's happened with the best of intentions. I think in that case, I've been very critical of Joe of late. I don't know if you've noticed on my podcast, but Joe has been a friend. He may yet still be a friend. I don't know. I've reached out to him privately, and that overture has gone unrequited. So maybe I'm in the process of burning that bridge as well. I mean, Elon used to be a friend, and he now emphatically is not. No, Joe is someone who imagines that just flipping on the microphone and talking to someone for 4 hours is all the journalistic integrity you need to allow sunlight to perform its much vaunted disinfecting work, right? And so he'll have someone like Darryl Cooper on the podcast, and not be at all alert to the fact that Darryl, knowingly or otherwise, has been infected with the bacillus of pseudo history, and has an appetite for taboo and contrarian takes on the Holocaust and World War II and the legacy of Hitler and Churchill, etc. And he has that appetite even in the midst of, again, the most alarming explosion of anti-Semitism to worldwide that any of us have seen in our lifetime. And so Joe has that conversation not at all prepared to debunk anything or resist anything, and just, his jaw keeps dropping with good-natured surprise at the revelations coming from this amateur historian, of whom he's a huge fan. And in Joe's defense, it's easy to see how one would be a huge fan. I mean, if you listen to Daryl's podcasts, he really does wear his good intentions on his sleeve. He just wants to understand people. He just wants to, see the humanity in everyone. He's against war, right? And there's just some fairly childlike and childish intuitions at the bottom of all of this behavior. I mean, you also have Joe's sidekick, Dave Smith, who is quite the revisionist historian himself about Ukraine, and also the history of Israel and its conflict with the Palestinians. And he goes on for hours and hours on Joe's podcasts and others, his own. He now jumps on Tucker Carlson's podcast and Piers Morgan, and he will debate all comers about the reality of there being a genocide in Gaza. And again, he's entirely self-taught. He's recycling, in some cases, David Irving. I mean, via Darryl Cooper, perhaps. He's, John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs, and lots of these scholars who, unfortunately, you can't dismiss merely as imposters, because some of these people at the back of all this have the right academic background, at least on paper. But these are strange people who are given to strange contrarian takes on some fairly well-established history and some obvious moral asymmetries in our world. And the whole thing is upside down, and yet it's not, you can't straightforwardly say that anyone in sight is actually motivated by anti-Semitism, right? That's what's so sinister about this. There are degrees of separation from actual anti-Semites, and yet one thing that could easily be noticed, and even Darryl Cooper has talked about this, is that when he looks into the funhouse mirror of his own audience, he notices that it is bursting with anti-Semites of every flavor, right? And he recently released a Substack newsletter on this topic, and strangely, he was he was given to differentiate among the various flavors of anti-Semite, picking the ones he likes over the ones he didn't like. He's happy to keep talking to the smart ones. It's the dumb ones who offend him. Anyway, so it's hard to perform a postmortem on what has produced this moral and political confusion. Again, on the in this case with Joe's podcast on the largest platform probably on planet Earth at the moment. But it's you can't merely allege that anyone is motivated by anti-Semitism, and that's what makes it confusing.
It has been, a year and a half since October 7th. As we sit here, actually, accurately 563 days, although for Israelis, it's just the same day since, to be honest. One of your episodes, I think 5 days after, of making sense of your podcast is called The Sin of Moral Equivalence. I have to tell you, it was widely circulated here. And following the sort of, I think, first heartbreak, which was October 7th, and then the second heartbreak, which was the world's reaction to October 7th, if, any of our listeners haven't heard that, if you could perhaps, kind of talk about the gist of what you were saying there. And I am curious to know, if we are a year and a half after, if there's something that changed in your thinking, or that is still how you would frame it today.
Yeah, well, there were a few podcasts I released at that point, and The Sin of Moral Equivalence was one of them. I think there's probably 3 or 4 that were kind of solo, audio essays, effectively. Yeah, I mean, my concern for now going on 25 years has been about jihadism generally and Islamism generally. The conflict with the values of open societies. Why you can call it Western culture, but it extends obviously beyond the West to really any open society and any liberal democracy. I just think we have a problem there, and Israel has this problem in its most excruciating form. but I do view it as of a piece with the problem that was the Islamic State, say, or the atrocities we've seen in Western Europe, like the attack on the Bataclan in Paris, or the Manchester bombing in London, or to pick your moment, the murder of the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists. This is all the same phenomenon in my view. It's more confusing between Israel and the Palestinians because there is this long history of intelligible political grievances there on both sides, and some missteps on both sides, and failed compromises on both sides, et cetera. And so you can get, if you focus narrowly on Gaza and the West Bank, and you notice the handful of extremist voices on the Israeli side that can seem to mirror the extremism on the jihadist side. And you guys are much more aware of the details there than I am, but I notice them occasionally getting cited. All of that can confuse the picture and make it seem like, okay, well, there's something Israel could fundamentally do differently that would have given us a two-state solution, and there's considerable onus on Netanyahu and all the people who failed to make those compromises. And there may be something to be said for that. But I think we have to admit that we have a larger problem that relates not to the specific grievances of any one community, but to the spread of some very dangerous ideas. And these ideas are at the bottom of jihadism, right? And jihadism is a real, religious project that's at the heart of Islam, and that obviously not all Muslims support it, but enough do so that it is a real global problem that can erupt more or less anywhere. And so, and the left in our open societies is quite confused about all this, and the right is not so confused about it. But the failure of a rational leftist response and secular response to the threat of jihadism and Islamism, in the more diluted form, has empowered a right-wing response that is nearly as odious as jihadism itself, right? So, I mean, this is to summarize this. My friend David Frum uttered this on a different topic, but it applies here. If liberals won't police borders, fascists will. Right. And what I've always worried, now going on a quarter century, is that the failure of well-intentioned liberal secularists to deal with this problem will summon the fascists and the Christian nationalists and the theocrats of a different flavor into the breach. And I think we see some of that happening in different places. So yeah, I'm worried about jihadism generally, and so by those podcasts, while I did focus on the problem of Hamas to some degree, you could trade Hamas for ISIS or Al Qaeda in virtually anything I say, and it's the same argument.
Your thought there about that if liberals don't do the job, then people of a more extreme hue will. I just wonder if you think something like that has happened in the Israel case. In other words, the argument you made straight after October the 7th. Does that argument look any different to you now? And I would accept what you were saying about the kind of singularity of violent jihadism. But does that argument look any different now, given the very particular flavor of government that is in charge in Israel now? In other words, it's not just a few theocrats and extremists on the fringes. They're in the government, and the set of decisions they've taken over the last 18 months to keep the war going, to return to it, even though hostage families, etc., were saying, please don't. The decision to, for example, cut off humanitarian aid and to be explicit about that, the death toll, 50,000 dead. Are you able to be as robust as you were in the days after October 7th in saying, look, these are completely incomparable dangers, now that the people policing the danger are of a different kind of color, of different political complexion from the one that you may have had in mind, as it were, in the abstract in general.
From where I sit, Netanyahu looks like an increasingly Trumpian character in that his own, personal political problems can be. One can certainly fear that they cloud his judgment and how he makes decisions for what Israel should do as a nation. But any far right figure is making messianic noises and talking about Amalekites. I mean, all of that is deeply inconvenient for you guys holding the moral high ground, or being perceived to hold the moral high ground. But I would just point out that even when you, without question, held the moral high ground, before you had done anything in response, much of the world turned on you and couldn't see which side was up ethically with respect to the current chapter of the conflict, and so that's a problem that has to be dealt with, and I'm not sure when you're talking about just how the war has been prosecuted in Gaza, despite the wishes of the families of hostages. Say, I'm not sure, even if you had the most impeccable, most rational, most compassionate people in charge. Again, from this distance, I'm not sure what tactical and strategic decisions would have been made differently, right? I mean, I think the hostage problem is just excruciating, and honestly, I don't know how your society or any society should navigate it. I mean, I like if you just roll back the clock to the Gilad Shalit moment. I'm imagining, again, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm imagining most people think that whatever it was, 1,027 to 1 formula was mistaken, right? That's a deal that should not have been made, because it just simply provokes the current moment, which is your enemies recognize that hostages are so valuable that they're always worth grabbing, and they can torture your society psychologically by doing so. I don't know what we do. I don't know what open societies do in the face of that, apart from, I mean, it's hard. I mean, again, this is not, it sounds so callous to say it in the moment where there are still hostages and there are still grieving families, et cetera. But it wouldn't surprise me if the right answer were, we don't negotiate for hostages anymore, right? I mean, I don't know how else you stop this process. And I don't know how, I mean, to put it in terms that Douglas Murray just did in his recent book, I don't know how you fight a war against an army that wants to maximize civilian death on its own side, right? I mean, that is what you face in Hamas, right? That is what you face in any jihadist death cult, right? For them, the deaths of their own non-combatants is a feature, not a bug. And it's certainly, and to a degree that I think none of us could have foreseen, it's a feature because how it manages to leverage world opinion to their advantage, right? I mean, it's just, it's amazing what has happened, like, again, on social media with the gaming of public opinion against Israel, based on, no doubt, a terrible death toll in Gaza, but based on, in many cases, fictional figures coming from Hamas that are accepted at face value, and again, against this insuperable challenge, which is how would, I mean, I take it, I'm sure there have been missteps by the IDF. I mean, we know there have been. I mean, there have been some recently, acknowledged, but I do believe that the IDF has done a better job of sparing innocent life than my own government would have or has in any of its conflicts against jihadists. It's like I think John Spencer is probably still the sanest voice. So this is the warfare expert from West Point who's done this analysis. It's just, if you look at what the IDF has faced in Gaza. And with all the details, the tunnel system and the density of population, and it's very hard to see that any army would have done a better job of this. And you can't, you have to imagine. I mean, what do you do against um, a suicidal death cult that is using its own civilians as human shields, right, and taking your civilians as hostages. It's a very difficult thing to respond to, and it's very hard for me to criticize anything that has been done, or to imagine that a much better leader than Netanyahu would have done things radically differently. Because I don't know what honestly I have never known what you should do in response, except the generic outcome the world over has to be achieved, which is, I think, the jihadist project has to be defeated, right? And in many cases that means a military defeat. I mean, there's a war of ideas here to be waged, and one with the Muslim world generally, no doubt, but we have to discredit jihadism in the way that some people, in the only way that some people understand, which is militarily, and you guys have been doing that. And if you had taken the advice of my government early on and not gone into Rafah, and therefore not killed Sinwar, I certainly I don't have any intuition that you'd be better off now, right? So it's like, what is the stopping point in Gaza? There's no point in this conflict could I have told you.
Yeah. I mean, it's very difficult, of course, as an Israeli, and as you say, there are 59 hostages still held. So it's very hard to say, let's try and analyze this from the moral philosophy perspective. That's almost impossible. But there are many in this country, actually 70% in every poll, saying whatever it, pay the price, which is to stop the war now, bring back the hostages, if that is an option, and then continue or find ways to continue this war that, as you say, because it is a war against jihadism, essentially it's not going to be over in a month or in a year. I mean, it's a very difficult, and of course in this country, a little bit like yours, right? Every argument is either you're for Trump or you're against him. Here it's either you're for Netanyahu or you're against him. So it's very hard to see above the din of that kind of dilemma. But it is a real question here.
Yeah, I can't dispute any of that. And yes, if you could get all the hostages back by some stratagem, and then declaring a ceasefire, and only then to renege on it, to then go after the jihadists, that would be, that would have my full support as well. I just like the idea. I don't see an outcome that leaves Hamas intact in any form, and then you just then have to wait for the next atrocity, right? I mean, I think Hamas has to be defeated, and Hezbollah has to be defeated, and ultimately there needs to be a regime change in Iran. I mean, I just think the writing is on the wall for all of this. How we get there is another question, but it's just jihadists can't possibly make good neighbors, right? In their own minds, they're simply waiting for the opportunity to promulgate further atrocities, right? I mean, that's just explicitly what they say to themselves, and they'll say to you if you ask. I mean, even in the midst of a ceasefire, ceasefires are merely an occasion for them to gather strength, and we're confused if we think that these people are rational actors, right? Who want the same things in life we want, and it's very easy to get lulled into that confusion, because it would be very consoling to believe that, but I just think the jihadist project itself needs to be recognized by 2 billion Muslims to be totally untenable, and that has to become explicit. And how we get there, again, it's a real challenge. It's a theological challenge, right? Because but somehow we got to a flavor of Christianity in the 21st century, which warts and all, is impressively different from the Christianity of the 14th century. Right. I mean, we're no longer burning witches on street corners or burning heretics, despite the fact that, there are still a few Christians out there who might want to return to that style of theocracy. It has been moderated by its collisions with the modern world, and Islam has to be similarly moderated. And there has to be an ultimatum there on all sides that moderation process continue. And jihadism is the most indigestible and pernicious core of all of that bad theology, and we need to be victorious over it. and that's again, there are many fronts to that, but you guys are on the most consequential one at the moment.
It's a little bit of a personal question, but I mean, you are an atheist and Jewish. Can you tell us how that balance changed or shifted for you after October 7th, if it did shift?
Well, I think it would have been true to say before October 7th that I'm still an atheist. I'm still a secularist. I still think that we're paying an intolerable price for the religious balkanization of our world. So I'm not a fan of sectarianism in any form. And I think before October 7th, you could have said that I was not a Zionist, right? Or I mean, I was certainly would be willing to call into question the legitimacy of organizing a state around a religion or a religiously identified ethnicity, right? Judaism in this case. I mean, I think I released a podcast some years ago titled, why don't I criticize Israel? Question
Yeah, that
mark.
was 10 years ago.
Yeah, and there I gave a fairly equivocal and frustrating defense of Israel. But I mean, I was troubled by, as someone who believes that we are paying this intolerable price for sectarianism. I was troubled by the seeming contradiction in defending the Jewish state, and for me, it just nets out to the only real defense is the ambient level of genocidal intolerance that's directed at Jews, right? I mean, just and yet before October 7th, even there, I felt like I was paying lip service to the legacy of the Holocaust without really having my heart was really not quite in it because it still seemed kind of hypothetical to me. I mean, because in my life, anti-Semitism has not seemed like a real variable at all. And apart from the Islamist version of it, it seemed to have been, more or less fully defanged, the world over. But given October 7th and given the response to it in the West, both on the left and on the right politically, um, but even most especially on the left, I mean, that was the most surprising. Um, yeah, I'm really, just kind of an unapologetic Zionist at this point. I mean, I just say, like, who can be counted upon to defend the Jews but the Jews? I think that's a question that for which you have to err on the side of the most cynical and depressing answer, which is, only the Jews can at the end of the day be counted upon to defend themselves. And I think they should have the right to do that. And having a Jewish state seems like certainly at the moment the only rational backstop to that project.
Just on, it may take us back to the point about the left you just mentioned there. But one thing that has surprised me a little bit is the United States in the era of Trump. Tell me if I'm wrong on this. I don't think there have been campus protests inside the United States against Donald Trump and, say, his deportations on anything like the scale there were on US campuses against the war, Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza. The American students on American campuses were more outraged by the conduct of the Israeli government than they have been so far by the Trump administration. I mean, tell me, first of all, just as an empirical matter, you're there, I'm here in Britain, whether that's right. But second, if it is right, what accounts for that beyond what some people reach for is to say, well, everyone hates the Jews, which is crudely put. I mean, the Tom Lehrer answer. What actually explains that differential? And maybe it's down to fear that people are frightened now of protesting on American campuses, but you tell us.
Yeah, well, I think that disparity is real. I mean, I certainly haven't seen any significant activity in response to Trump and Trumpism, this time around. Certainly nothing by comparison with what we saw after October 7th. I mean, I do think that social media was weaponized to a degree that I don't even directly understand because I'm not I'm not spending my time on it and wasn't then. I mean, I got off Twitter like 2.5 years ago, but it's clearly, I mean, what happened on TikTok and all these platforms, X and the the calculated campaign that helped engineer the protests. I mean, it was pretty clear that Students for Justice in Palestine was a confection with direct ties to Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, this is not just an ordinary student group that finally found its feet after October 7th. There was a lot of money flowing in and a lot of coordination, but it was also just it had a mimetic power that in part may be attributable to anti-Semitism. I don't know, but it for whatever reason it became the cause célèbre for this younger generation at that moment, and yeah, their moral energy, as confused as it was, got laser focused on Gaza.
And why are they not similarly laser focused on what Trump is doing, saying, threatening to do?
Well, one can imagine that there's not the same kind of coordinated action behind it. And I think that the left is a little exhausted and confused as to what to do in this moment. I mean, it's pretty obvious that the extreme identity politics and social justice ideology of the left is in part why we have Trump for a second time in the first place. I mean, if you're going to ascribe the reasons for Kamala Harris's loss 6 months ago, wokeism and identity politics are at the top of almost every sane person's list. So there is, I think, understandably, a fair bit of soul searching and a loss of energy on the left, and and we really should. I'm hopeful that we understand that the fringe voices on the far left have not been at all helpful to democratic politics, and they won't be listened to going forward. But there's the Democrats really have not sorted themselves out politically, at least to my eye. From college students on up, every response left of center to Trump and Trumpism has been pretty anemic, and that's hopefully that will change. But it's just the nature of the mood at the moment.
We've been dragging you through the quagmire of the Middle East and the quagmire of American politics, but I wonder if we could talk about talking or the art of conversation, because one of the things that you try and do is take on these debates with people who, you ideologically oppose, and to have these serious discussions, thoughtful, in depth. And I kind of wonder what happened to that art, because I keep thinking about American television. In 2003, this is a shocking thing to think about, but Rachel Maddow and Tucker Carlson not only had were on the same network, which was MSNBC, but they had the same show. They were pundits on a show on MSNBC, it's beyond science fiction today that these two people would ever be able to have a conversation. What happened?
What's happening instead of really good debate and honest debate is a kind of
Circus?
Pantomime of debate aimed at some kind of reconciliation, which is, let's just talk in a good-natured way. If we can just get to the end of this conversation with good vibes, our work is done, right? And so you have people platforming fairly extreme voices and not pushing back at all on the biggest podcasts, right? And yet there's this illusion that the two sides have met, right? I mean, I just noticed this perhaps this is too far afield for you, but my state's governor Gavin Newsom has a podcast, and he's been platforming some of the most grotesque characters to come out of Trumpistan, and doing it with just this sort of fawning, friendly. I mean, I don't even know what to call it. I mean, it's this embrace of their success on some level. He interviewed Charlie Kirk. They disagree about everything politically. Charlie Kirk is in no sense a good faith actor. He's someone who should be castigated and criticized and made to feel uncomfortable from the first sentence of a podcast like that. And yet all Newsom could communicate was his admiration for how successful he has been in building his brand in building the movement of Trumpism, in reaching the young. It's just so amazing that you've managed to do that. How did you do it, Charlie? And that was the collision between left and right there. And there's really a lot of that. I mean, there's a lot of, if you look at the podcast that had Trump on prior to the election, where he reached so many people, I think decisively, he reached people who were like low information voters and low likelihood voters. And I think he managed to turn out a lot of them. And it was these, hour upon hour of seemingly humanizing conversations with people who, in some cases, could rightly claim to be his political opponents in terms of their political leanings, and yet there was no real opposition given in the conversation, right? So it's kind of access journalism of a sort that is, is designed not to get anywhere near the truth, but to just not close the door to the next time you might want to talk to this character. And it's really, I mean, our antibodies against bullshit and nefarious ideas have really deserted us here. And so there are real journalists doing real things out there. But if you're talking about the biggest platforms at the moment, it's there's not a lot of what you want happening.
This may be this is certainly, I think, is related to that. You mentioned earlier in our conversation that you moved yourself off Twitter, and that was a good thing. I've heard you describe it as the single biggest life hack that has improved and I think a lot of listeners should take note. But what does the internet or social media, define it as you want to, because locate whichever bit is more important. Do you think done to our brains? I mean, you're a neuroscientist. I'm curious to know what you think it's done to our brains and our behavior. And I think crucially, whether whatever it has done can be reversed.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm certainly worried about it. I mean, I often describe this as the world's largest psychological experiment to which we've all been enrolled without our consent. Obviously it's fragmented our attention. It's given us a sense of, certainly anyone who has a public-facing profile on social media, there's a sense of that your digital reputation is in many ways even more real than your life in the real world, right? And it's there's something profoundly disorienting about it. I mean, and also you see, some of these platforms are worse than others. I mean, what was so bad about Twitter, now X, from my point of view, is that it produced a kind of simulacrum of conversation and debate. But what was really happening is that when people were colliding on the platform and seeming to talk to one another, they were, in truth, really just messaging to their own audience, right? So there's this kind of performance of debate or collisions, but they're really just trying to leverage their own tribe and their followers against the other target. And so there's this, it's almost like it was selecting for an increasingly sociopathic orientation toward everyone else, right? And then I was starting to see people who I knew, had every reason to believe weren't sociopaths, effectively behave like sociopaths, on the platform, because they were just being incentivized to be that way. They'd be just dishonest and completely carefree about their dishonesty. They were simply defaming other people and just seeing what would stick, knowing that they were almost certainly trafficking in lies and half truths. And also journalism has been bent by this, and essentially outsourced its editorial judgment to what is happening on these social media platforms, and it's starting to write to the controversy that's happening on the platform. So it was easy enough to say that Twitter wasn't real life until it increasingly became real life, because we couldn't take our eyes off it. It's still true to say that getting off of social media has been really the best thing I've done for my life in the last 10 years. I mean, again, what's embarrassing about that is it's a little bit like saying, stopping, poking myself in the eye with a pencil every day has been the best life hack I've found. One then asks, why were you doing that in the first place? which is how I feel about Twitter. But it's the truth is, I have I have this incredible luxury of having already built a platform and kind of consciously immunized myself against cancellation in all kinds of ways. So I had a luxury to, like I had, I think 1.5 million followers on Twitter at that point, or X, and I could delete that without a thought because I had, built enough so that the voice in my head which thought, "Oh, what are you, crazy? You still need this to market yourself. You have to be on social media, otherwise, no one's going to know what you're thinking. You're cutting your nose off to spite your face here." Um, I understand why people, like ordinary journalists or people who are um, don't have as much of a platform as I have, feel like they still need to be in the game there. Otherwise, they're they're harming their brand, or the one marketing channel open to them is somehow now they're not going to use. Um, but I really do think that we have a collective action problem here. We have to collectively recognize that this is toxic, that this is that we've built the tools by which, if nothing else, our foreign adversaries can weaponize against us, right? I mean, we know that there's just the troll farms and bots and all of this and also just Elon himself deciding to tune the algorithm every which way. This has become a a digital playpen for some very bad actors, and it is distorting our view of ourselves. So we're gazing into this funhouse mirror and finding ourselves and our neighbors to be increasingly grotesque. And it's very difficult to know what is real. I mean, because you go out into the real world and people, for the most part, are really nice. And in face-to-face encounters, they won't treat you the way they'll treat you online, with the callousness and with the dishonesty they'll display toward you online. It just doesn't happen face to face, or it rarely does. And so we've created some kind of digital circumstance for our own undoing, and it remains to be seen, whether we can survive contact with this increasingly grotesque object indefinitely. I mean, I don't know if you told me, you looked into a crystal ball and said, "Oh, actually, in 20 years we just wind up killing ourselves, right? We just, we the big bombs all fly in 20 years. Why do you think that happened?" Again, I think social media will have an enormous role in that story.
So take your pencil out of your eye is an important thing to learn. And as we're sort of winding up our conversation, I can't let you go without talking, as a representative of a country of 10 million people who have been relentlessly stressed out for the past year and a half, whether it be rockets from Gaza or Lebanon or Iran or Yemen. I wonder, kind of using that other hat of yours in the sort of the meditations, Sam Harris, in your app and waking up. What would could you have any sort of advice for, not even for Israelis, but I mean, there's so many things to worry about in this world. And I think we went through our conversation. We didn't even pick all of them yet, but is there kind of an advice that you could give, anyone who is really, really feeling this anxiety about just living in this world, even if it's not in the Middle East?
Well, I mean, the one insight, I mean, there are many insights you get from meditation, but one that is relevant here is that negative mind states like fear or anxiety or anger, moral outrage, they're useful in that they are salient signals. I mean, they give you information about the world that you probably should pay attention to. They tell you what is, they alert you to real problems that are worth responding to. But then there's this added question of, how unhappy do you have to be in the meantime? Like once you learn that you have cancer and now you need surgery, a week from Tuesday, how unhappy do you have to be? How terrified do you have to be? How uh, ruled by the uncertainty do you have to be until you get the surgery, right? And that's and on some level, we're all in that circumstance, even without a diagnosis, right? I mean, we're living the challenge for us as people is to figure out how much well-being is available to us in a condition of profound uncertainty, and in truth, where the only real certainty is ultimately is death, right? I mean, the only real certainty is if you live long enough, you're going to lose everyone you love, right? I mean, that's just, the healthiest person is going to be on some level going to be the unluckiest one. I mean, that's the person whose phone is never going to stop ringing, and with bad news, um, and yet life offers this opportunity to be, profoundly happy and profoundly in love with the people close to you and with just the circumstance of beauty in this world. And so I mean, all of that is still available, even in a condition of real emergency, right? I mean, this is what's so weird about, even reports from people who are in the middle of a war, right? I mean, you see the worst of human nature, but you also see some of the best of human nature. And, some people who fight wars come back, and their problem thereafter is they'll never experience that much meaning in their lives again, right? So we have to figure out how to locate what is sacred in the present moment with our attention, and that's just another name for meditation, and so that it is always available. And the obstacle to doing that is being lost in thought about everything that worries you about the future and everything you regret from the past, and that's something you can cease to do for only moments perhaps only for moments at a time, but those moments really are precious.
See, now that would be the obvious point for us to end our conversation, but I have ringing in my ears your warning that some people think it's good
He's
to
not
get
going
to
to
the
let
end
me
of a
have the final
podcast.
question. That's the thing.
So I have ringing in my ears your warning that there is a genre of podcasts that think so long as they get to the end with good vibes, then
Right,
that's
yes.
fine, and they don't always do
Well,
the
we did
challenge.
that.
So we did do that,
It's
but I
not
just want to end with
necessarily a failing.
no. I want to just go back to one last thing, just for as a parting. It's a
Sure.
challenge.
Give me some bad vibes. Let's break the pattern
His
here.
good vibe was to say we all die in the end, Jonathan. I don't know if you noticed. That was
I did notice that.
Okay, never mind.
I did notice that you're going to have the phone calls with bad news. But no, here's just one challenge that came up earlier in our conversation. The conversation moved on. I didn't go to it, but I just want to, because it's something that I wrestle with from the, you and Christopher Hitchens when he was around, or Richard Dawkins, your fellow horseman, when you wrote that, incredibly influential book on atheism and so on, which is when you said that you was absolutely rigorous in our conversation in talking about jihadism and talking about and being very precise rather than Islam or even Muslims. You focused it there. Yep. But nevertheless, in some of your writings, you have talked about this culture overall, and that, in that piece that Yonit referred to after October 7th, you talked about the Quran and Islam. And you're scrupulous in saying you don't have an issue with Muslims, you're not some kind of prejudiced person against Muslims, but you do have an issue with Islam. And I just want to know how that's possible to hold that without, in the end, being prejudiced against the group who hold those set of beliefs. And the reason I ask it is, if somebody said to me, with as much good faith as you do, I have no problem with Jews, my issue is Judaism, I think that would grate on a lot of Jewish ears. They would think, I'm not so sure about you. How can you be opposed to a belief, but not opposed to the believers in that belief?
Yeah, that's an important question. Thanks for asking it. Well, so what I'm always talking about is the power of ideas, right? And so yeah, the power of ideas is instantiated in the behavior of the people who are convinced of the truth of those ideas. So I am talking about people and their behavior in the end, but people can be argued out of ideas. People can change their minds. People can leave the faith, and they do that. And so there are ways to dissect this out with it that make it pretty clear. So, for instance, I know people who are ex-Muslims, right? They're born, in Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or somewhere. They were indoctrinated into the faith as kids, and now they are atheists who believe none of that stuff. I think so, to win the war of ideas of the sort that I was describing earlier, I think these are the most important people on earth, right? I mean, and there's some of the most embattled people on earth. I mean, because given the
You wouldn't want Jews to
animosity
be
held.
ex-Jews, would you?
So I'm just I'm trying to figure out which end of this to tackle first. So the difference with Judaism, the reason why Islamophobia is not as a concept is not truly homologous with the concept of anti-Semitism, is that when you look at what anti-Semitism is, the animus toward Jews and Judaism is rather often consciously directed at a race of people, an ethnicity, indelible characteristics that cannot be changed. We're not talking about beliefs and doctrine. We're talking about Jewish blood on some level. If you're looking at the history of anti-Semitism, that is, certainly the history, the recent history going back through, the 19th century, right? Start the clock around 1870 or so, where I think you actually get the word anti-Semitism, and you look at its most horrible products, i.e. the Holocaust. It is explicitly a racist doctrine focused on characteristics that a person can't change about themselves. It's not just what they believe. It's what they are despite what they believe from the point of view of the anti-Semite. And I would also add, from the point of view of most Jews, I mean, most Jews think of themselves as belonging to a race of people, and the genealogy, the fact that your mother's 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 mother was Jewish, is a relevant variable, right? It's not, Judaism isn't a missionary faith that is looking for converts, right? And the moment you convert, you're just as Jewish as anyone. I mean, that's not the game that Jews have been playing. And not to say that people don't convert, but it's not a missionary faith. Islam is the most missionary of missionary faiths. It's all about the ideas. It's all about what you profess. I could become Muslim, at the end of this podcast, to the surprise and consternation of some of your audience. But it could really be accomplished, and I would, then I would be a Muslim, right? And then if I disavowed the faith, I'd really be an apostate. And many Muslims would imagine that the only appropriate penalty for that is death. It really is a matter of the ideas, and Islam is a religion that exists in 100 countries. It's not an ethnicity. It's not. And so my concern about Islam is really is a concern for the spread of ideas. And again, I mean, you're right to point out that I demarcate that with the concepts like jihadism and Islamism, but it's also true that just kind of center of the fairway conservative Islam does pose some problems for us in terms of our modern values. I mean, just the status of women under Islam, in a traditional Muslim context, is something that I think we're right to be concerned about. Compulsory veiling is not good for women, and the fact that you can prop up some women in veils who will insist that it is good for them and they find it empowering because they are throwing off the male gaze, etc. It's just, I think there's reasons to not be taken in by that. I mean, most women the world over who are wearing the veil are not doing it as an expression of their feminist empowerment. They're doing it because they're forced to by the men in their society, who will treat them like whores or worse if they don't. So I think Islam needs a reformation. It needs an enlightenment that it hasn't quite had. The thing what's unique about Judaism is that you can even talk about being an atheist Jew or even an atheist rabbi, and have that not be a total non sequitur. You can't do that with Christianity or Islam. You can't say I'm an atheist. I'm an atheist, but my Christianity is very important to me. or that, I'm an atheist, but Islam is very important to me. It's just that species of person doesn't exist because of how uncompromising the doctrines are on this specific point. I mean, there are things you absolutely must believe that are constitutive of being a Muslim or a Christian, and you can't quite say. I mean, I guess the ultra orthodox would want to say the same thing about Judaism, but Judaism has just been so attenuated by secularism that it's just not. I've been on a stage with a conservative rabbi, a so-called conservative rabbi. He calls himself a conservative rabbi, who blindsided me with how infinitely elastic his belief and non-committal his belief was in God. I mean, at one point I said something that presupposed that he believed in a God that could hear our prayers. And he said, "What would make you think I believe in a God who can hear prayers?" Right. And then I'm like, okay, well, then what are we talking about here? Right. But he's a conservative rabbi. I won't
Yeah.
name him, but he's, those debates exist on YouTube to be found. So Judaism is people are easily confused when they extrapolate from Judaism as a religion to Christianity and Islam. And they're confused when they extrapolate from Christianity to Islam. I mean, for instance, just the concept of fundamentalism within Christianity is not quite, we talk about fundamentalist Islam, but so much of Islam is fundamentalist to the degree that Christianity is only in a fairly small percentage in the U.S. So we have to be careful analogizing from one religion to another.
I mean, Sam Harris, we could talk to you for another 4 hours, but we concede the fact that you have a life. And so
it's been a joy to have spent this long with the two of you, because again, I'm a huge fan of your podcast, and I just want to encourage you to keep doing what you're doing, because you have been not only a source of sanity in these last year and a half, but just a proper education in the politics and just a fact-based discussion of what's happening in Israel. And so I've been very grateful to have you to listen to.
we're honored you think so. Thanks so much. Thank you.
He's such a fascinating, very, very, eloquent speaker. I found lots there fascinating. One, his point that October the 7th made him a Zionist, that he wasn't before. There are lots of people like him, actually. People with, in his case, I think he has one Jewish parent, people who, sort of being Jewish wasn't central to their identity. October the 7th made Zionists of a whole lot of them, and fascinating to hear that he was one.
He doesn't mince words, Sam Harris. He's very, very clear on his thoughts and the way that our minds have been, rewired due to social media and what to do about that. How to, the fact that he has been off Twitter for a long time, I think is also something that's interesting advice for the rest of us. But the way that he manages to, connect the philosophy, the deep thinking, the meditation, and also the conversations that are sometimes unpleasant, but still need to happen as conversations if they are authentic, if they're honest, if they're in depth. And I think that is the part of the importance of what he does.
Yeah, there was one thought I had afterwards, which is he had said that, as if there were these two poles, that you either do everything you can to prevent casualties, or there is, the pursuit of genocide, and as if in this sort of black and white choice. I do think there is a sort of third category, which is actually not caring enough about civilian casualties. In other words, I don't, obviously make, I wouldn't describe Israel as doing either of the other two extremes, but I think not caring enough about them is where we are with this government. And I did remember that episode back in 2003 when Israel had in its sights a house containing a whole lot of Hamas commanders, but there were also civilians there, and so they changed from dropping a 1-ton bomb to a quarter of the payload in order to spare civilians. That was the thinking a generation ago. I don't think that is the thinking now. And in a way, that's just a sort of, it was a thought that came to me after our conversation that you don't have to, polarize it that way. Anyway, the point is that, as always,
there's something that happened between those 10 years. Just saying.
It was 22 years ago. Yeah, no, sure. But Israel was in a serious war then too, after suicide bombings. It wasn't October the 7th. But I think the point about they understood that you actually just recruit more people to Hamas's cause if you kill civilians on this sort of scale. I don't think that understanding is there now. It was hardly a dovish government in 2003. I think it was then Ariel Sharon. And the point being, a conversation with Sam Harris sparks lots and lots of thoughts, and this one did too. So we are very grateful to him for that.
So we should, I think, go on to our awards. Can I start?
You should. Go on.
Look, never a shortage of Chutzpah Award nominees, but I think this week the people who really take the cake on this are the Likud members of Knesset responding to Naftali Bennett, a very clear political rival of Prime Minister Netanyahu, being hospitalized. Now, what you do in these cases, pretty simple, get well soon. We, hope you have a speedy recovery. This is not complicated. I hope you will agree. And what they did instead, a few members of Knesset from the Likud, you'd have these tweets in which they would say things like, I hope this is an opportunity for him to examine his conscience. I hope it's clear to you that if a 53-year-old man collapses from working out, would he be able to manage 7 arenas of conflict, says a lawmaker named Osher Shkalim. For many Israelis, the first time they heard of him, and probably the last, Tali Gottlieb, saying, we haven't forgotten what you did. Maybe you should abandon your style of false promises and remember you used the votes of the right-wing religious public and allied yourself with the Muslim Brotherhood. This goes on and on. I mean, as I said, the famous American adage, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. This could apply here, I think. We are living in a world in which just basic human politeness has somehow been thrown out the window.
Yeah, I think a worthy nominee. Message to politicians: don't get sick. But no, I think appalling behaviour and a worthy chutzpah winner for our Mensch Award. Just to nod back to the conversation we were having about the Independence Day ceremonies, I note that the 5 female IDF spotters, sort of lookout soldiers who were there on the border, who were held hostage, Agan Berger, Liri Albag, Daniela Gilboa, Nana Levy, and Karina Ariev, were all invited, according to reports, to join that torchlighting ceremony. And it seems none have accepted the offer to do so. They don't want to participate in this ceremony, showing you again how this has become partisan and political. They don't want to be used, in effect, as props for a government that they believe, I think it's fair to infer, is not doing enough for the hostages. A shout out to them. A small story here locally, here in Britain, but just part of this point I was making before about there's got to be room in the sort of pro-Israel community for people who aren't wholly loyal to the government of the day. Just 36 members of what the representative body of British Jewry are facing disciplinary action from that body because they signed an open letter criticising the Netanyahu government's conduct of the war in Gaza, announcing themselves all as people who believe in Israel and are dedicated to it. But, on various grounds, they're now subject to a complaints procedure. I won't get into the weeds of exactly why. And, we can all think their letter probably should have said much more condemning Hamas and so on. The point is, though, they announce themselves as people who believe in Israel and want to see Israel survive and thrive. There's got to be room for people like them, whether it is at the torchlighting ceremony or in communal Jewish community organizations around the world. And so I think those people who do, insist on that right to be supportive, but with their conscience intact and still critical, I think they can count themselves as Mensches this week.
We're wrapping up our show this week, reminding you of our live event, June 8th in London, Jonathan's Hood. We might have one in Tel Aviv. sometime in the future. But till then, we're saying our goodbyes, and we'll meet next week. And our thank yous to Michal Porat, of course, and we'll meet next week.
See you then.